and welcome to lesson 2 of week 7. In this lesson we are going to look at more input types and then we are going to look at the other form elements. My name is Mildred. In the last lesson we created 2 forms. We designed a form for collecting case reporting information, and then we created another form to illustrate other types of input. I have created a registration form, and on this form we want to collect registration information, and we are going to use the input types that we have not discussed, and we're going to illustrate how to use them here. So we'll start by putting our form tag, and then we want to put a label, and this label is going to be for, let's say we're collecting email address, and then the input type for email is going to be email. So it enforces that an email address, a valid email address, must be entered into this field. The ID is email, and let's put a name attribute and we'll name it email. When I save this, I go to my page and I open my register page. So let me open the register.html. I have this here, and so every time I try to enter a text that is not an email, it will ask me to put a valid email when I try to submit. So we're going to look at this when we put a submit button at the end. So we're going to look at another type of input field, which is going to be URL. Let's say we want the user to enter a URL of their profile. So let's say this is label for profile, close label, and then input type is going to be URL, name URL, and then the ID profile. So you can make the name profile or whatever name you want. Always make sure that you use meaningful names. So when I save this, I refresh my page. We are not going to see the functions here until we put a submit button, and then we're going to try to enter the values. So I'm going to break this so that we'll have this on a new line. So we're going to look at another input type, which is the hidden type. Now the input type hidden is going to have an input that is not going to be displayed on the page for the users, but most of the time when we use this, we put a value in this, and when we submit the form, this value is sent along with the form submission. So let's say the value here is Mildred and the name here is Mildred. So while the users cannot see this, the value is submitted to the processing page when we process the form. So you can't see any input with the type of hidden displayed on the page. So we have another input type, which is the input type of image. And when we use the image input type is when we want to insert an image. Let's say I want to put a submit button, but I want it to be an image, or I want to put a next button that will show them a next page to continue filling this form. And so when I put input type of image, I will put a source attribute, and then I want to put an image here. And let's say I want the image from the images folder. I have a next.jpg image, so I'm going to use this. So I'm going to images / next.jpg, and then I'll put the name as next. And what I'll do here is to put the height attribute. I want to have the image to be 40 pixels, and then I'll put the width attribute also, and I want it to be also 40. So I want a small image and I want it to be a button. So I'll save, refresh my page, and I have that next button here, so that when the user clicks this, it will take the user to a next form or the next page. So we're going to use JavaScript to see what we are going to do, or what happens when this is clicked. We have an input type of button. If you want a button on the page, a clickable button that does nothing by itself except you apply JavaScript or you give it an action to perform. So this is like the submit button on the page, but it doesn't do anything by default. It does not send the page for processing by default. So when we have the input type of button, I'm going to delete all of this. We use the value attribute to write what will be displayed on the button. So we want this to be next, and then we can also add the name here to be next. So when I save and I refresh, we will see we have a button. It looks like the submit button, but the difference is that this does not automatically send the form for processing. It only presents a button that does nothing by default. So we have other form elements apart from the input elements that we can use to collect information on a page. To illustrate this, I will go back to my forms and recall that in the last lesson we created this form. Let's go to the web page to see what the form looks like. So we have a form that collects all of this field. I want to add more form fields to this, and I want to use other form elements for this. So we have the reset and the submit button, but before the button I want to add more fields or to collect more data. Let's say I want to collect something like sexual orientation. So always remember you have to put your label, and I'll put my label is going to be for sex orientation, and I'll put sexual orientation. I want to have a drop down menu where the users will select from a list of items, and for this we use the select element. So it has a close tag, and then at the start tag we use the ID attribute to bind it to the label. So the ID is sex orientation, and then we're going to also give it a name, and we'll make the name sex orientation. This by itself doesn't do anything on the page. When we refresh, we will see that it has nothing. What we will do is to add the options that the user will see and select from. And so I'm going to put the option tag between the start and the end select tag, and I'm going to write the option that the user is going to see. So let's say the first option is heterosexual. The start option tag takes the value attribute, which will specify the value that should be submitted when this option is selected. So we want the value heterosexual to be submitted. I'll copy this and I'll create more options. The next one we want is homosexual. The next one we want is bisexual. And the last one we are going to use other. So there are more sexual orientations, but we're going to stop here for this demonstration. When I save this and I refresh my page, we are going to see a list of all of them, and by default the first option on the list is selected. You can change this by putting a selected attribute on any one you want to be selected by default. So let's say I want the bisexual to be selected by default. I'll put the selected attribute. When I refresh, I will have bisexual selected by default. But this is not the best way to do this. What I will normally do in my design is to put a first option which has no value and is going to just give the user select one, and then I will close option and I'll put the selected attribute here, and then when I refresh, select one is selected by default. So whether I put the selected or not, because it is the first, it is also always going to be selected. You can also put an attribute called the disabled attribute to make sure that once the user clicks here, especially when it is required, they can't come back to this. It becomes unclickable, unusable. So when I click homosexual, I cannot come back to put select one, because at this point I must make a choice. So we have looked at the select form elements. We have other form elements. We have the text area element. Let's say we want the user to have a free field where they can enter notes. So I'll say label for notes, input other notes, close label. And then we have an element called the text area element, written text area, and then we close text area. The text area takes attributes like the rows and the calls attributes, and we put the rows like this, and we can make it to define the number of rows that the text area size will be. So let's say we want it to be 10, and we also want it to have a size of 5 columns on the page, and then we'll give it a name. The name is equal to notes, and then the ID is equal to notes. Save this, refresh my page, I have the text area. And so the browsers now always allow you to resize this if you want to resize it, but it allows you to enter multiple lines of text, as many text as you want, here. So this is what we use the text area to do. So if you have large volume of text to enter, multiple lines, not just a single line of text, you want to use the text area form element. We have another form element, which is the button element. Let's say we want to have a clickable button on the page. This has an input type of reset. Let's say we don't want to have this input type, we want to have a button. So I can put button. So you always want to make the type button because you want this to be used maybe by JavaScript to have a particular action that will be taken when the button is clicked. And so I want this button name to be reset, and the name is reset, and it's not going to do anything by default until I add an action to this button. So when I refresh my page, you'll see that it remains the same button on the page. So the input type of button, input type of submit, and the button form element all presents the same way. The actions are what differs. The button form element does nothing by default. The input type of button does nothing by default. You always have to provide further action using JavaScript. So I will use the reset button back here. So we have another form element, which is the field set and the legend element. I'm going to illustrate this on the registration form. So let's go back to the registration form and redesign this using the field set and the legend. So we have this form and we want to organize it better. I will use a field set. And I'll close field set. Just after the start field set, I will put a legend which will give this little container a heading. So let's say, please identify, or please sign up with your identity. Close legend. We want the user to be able to upload maybe their documents. There is an input type we did not discuss, which I'm seeing that we might need. We want an input type of file. So I'm going to put a label for resume. So I'll put resume, close label, and then I'll put an input with a type of file. The ID is equal to resume and the name is equal to resume break. So I'm going to break everything and we are going to see how this form looks, having the field set and the legend to create a container to enclose all of this. So recall that we said in the previous lesson that later on we are going to style the form elements, but for now we are going to leave them like this so that we can see how they look by default. So when I refresh this page, we see what the field set has done, created a container, and then what we use as a legend is the text we see as the heading of the container. So when you use the input type of email here, you have to enter an email address. If I enter anything that is not an email and I click on the next button, because this is a button, it does nothing. It doesn't submit the form. So recall that we want to have an input with a type of submit so that it submits this form to an action that we did not specify. So we're going to look at that in the next lesson. But for now, let's see how this is validated. This is not a valid email. And so when I choose next, it tells this is missing a valid email. So I'm going to put a valid email address. And then I'm going to try to enter a profile URL. This is not the pattern of a website or a URL, so it's going to tell me to enter a valid URL. And when I enter a valid URL like https://github.com, you will see that this will try to process the form by sending it to the URL using the default get method. With the input type of file, when you click on choose file, it allows you to select a file from your system, so you can navigate to the directory where the file you want to choose resides. So this is how we use the field set, the legend, and we use the input with the type of file to create form on the page. The last form element we are going to look at is the data list form element, and we're going to illustrate this here on this page. So we're going to do this with the forms, and let's look at the data list. Now, if you want the users to be able to just type in while there is a predefined list of options on the page, you can use the data list element, and it is written like this. So let's put a label for, let's repeat the sexual orientation. So let's say label for sex orientation 2, and then the name is sexual orientation, close label. And then for the data list, you use an input like this with the list attribute, and you put a value for the list attribute, and let's say this value is sex orientation 2. And then you have to have the data list element now written like this. Now the data list element must have an ID attribute with a value that is equal to the value of the list of these inputs to bind it together. So the value is sex orientation 2. We'll close data list down here, and then between the start and end data list, you need to have the options. So the option here is going to have a value of, let's say, homosexual. The next option is going to have a value. So this way we have created the options that is going to bring a suggestion to the user when they start typing. So when I save this and I refresh this page, we have the different form elements that we have and that we're going to be using. In the next lesson, we're going to look at the attributes that we use with the different form elements and the different input types to change or enhance the functionalities of these fields. Thank you, and see you in the next lesson.